The courtroom doors swung open. Two people walked in that nobody expected. A young black man in a tailored suit, sharp and composed, moving with the quiet authority of someone who had learned to command rooms without raising his voice. And beside him, a white woman in an expensive coat, the kind that cost more than Marcus Jefferson made in 2 months. Her dark hair pulled back, her eyes focused, like someone who had been chasing truth for a very long time. They walked straight past the gallery, past the rows of spectators who turned their heads, following their movement, straight to the defense table, where Marcus sat in shackles, a black man in his mid-50s, completely still, his hands flat on the table in front of him, his eyes closed, as if he was somewhere else entirely. The prosecutor leaned toward his assistant. He whispered, "Who are they?" The courtroom held its breath. The answer to that question would shake the entire room. It would reveal a truth that had been buried beneath layers of lies, corruption, and convenient scapegoating for more than 20 years. But before we understand who they are, before we understand why their arrival in that courtroom matters so much, we have to go back, 21 years back, to a man named Marcus Jefferson, to the quiet, impossible choice that changed everything. The camera fades to black. A title appears on screen. But this story didn't start in a courtroom. It started in the winter 21 years ago, with an act of simple humanity that would define the rest of his life. It was February 2004, and Marcus Jefferson had learned to love the quiet hours. He was 34 years old, a maintenance worker at Blackwell Lumber Mill, on the outskirts of Macon, Georgia, the kind of job that left sawdust in your lungs, calluses on your hands that never fully healed, no matter how many times you washed them. He worked the night shift, had been working nights for 12 years. He had gotten good at existing in the spaces between midnight and dawn, when the city held its breath, when the city pretended to sleep. 3 years ago, his wife Linda had died. Cancer. The kind that moves fast, that doesn't give you time to prepare, doesn't give you time to say all the things you meant to say. She had a laugh that could fill a room, fill a house, fill every corner of a life with light. Then she was gone, and the house got quiet, so quiet that sometimes Marcus would turn on the radio, just to hear another voice, just to feel less alone in the silence. They had never had children. It was something Linda wanted, something they had tried for, something that never happened. So when she died, the house didn't just lose a presence. It lost potential. It lost the future they had imagined, the family they had wanted to build. Marcus went to work, came home, sat on the porch, and watched the sun go down, over a street where everyone knew his name. But nobody really knocked on his door anymore. Not since Linda died. Not since there was nobody to host dinner. Nobody to make the house feel like a home. Just a place where he slept. That particular evening in February started like every other evening. Marcus had just finished a double shift at the mill. 12 hours of checking equipment, repairing machinery, dealing with the small and large disasters that happen when wood is being processed at speed. He was tired. The kind of tired that comes from physical work. Bone tired, the kind of tired where your body feels heavier than it should. He almost drove straight home. He almost skipped the grocery store on the corner, the one where he usually stopped, to pick up rice or beans, whatever was on sale that week. But rice was on sale that particular evening, and Marcus had learned something important. You didn't ignore sales, not when you were living on a maintenance worker's salary. So he pulled into the parking lot, turned off his truck, and headed inside. He saw them before he even reached the entrance to the store. 2 children sitting on the metal bench outside, the kind of bench they put there, for people waiting for rides that never come. A boy and a girl, both white, both underdressed for the weather. The boy looked about 7 years old, the girl maybe 5, possibly younger. Their coats were thin, the kind that provides no real warmth, just the idea of warmth. Their faces were flushed red from the cold, but neither of them was crying. The boy had his arm around his sister's shoulder, holding her close, with the kind of practiced steadiness. That said, he had done this many times before. That gesture, more than anything else, made Marcus slow down. Something about the way that child held his sister. Not panicked, not dramatic, just firm. Like it was his only job in the world, made something shift inside Marcus. He stopped walking altogether and crouched down to their level. "You two waiting on somebody?" His voice was gentle, the kind of voice people use when they're talking to children they don't know. The boy looked up at him. Gray eyes. Eyes that carried far too much weight for a 7-year-old. Eyes that had seen things no child should have to see. He didn't flinch away from Marcus, but he didn't smile either. He just met his gaze directly. "Our aunt dropped us off this morning. She said she'd be right back." Marcus looked at his watch. It was past 5 o'clock. The sun was already bleeding orange on the horizon. Darkness was coming fast. February darkness in Georgia comes hard and early. The temperature was dropping steadily. He looked back at the children. They were shivering. Both of them, their bodies drawn tight against the cold. "This morning?" "Yeah." The boy's voice was small but steady. "She said she'd be back real quick. We've been waiting." Marcus learned the rest of the story in pieces. The way you learn difficult things, in fragments, that add up to something unbearable. Their mother had died 3 weeks earlier. An overdose. The boy said it simply, without inflection. The way you might say it rained yesterday. Their father had never been in the picture, not even a name on a birth certificate. A maternal aunt had taken temporary custody, but temporary it turned out was a generous way of describing what had actually happened. She had left them at this grocery store before dawn and hadn't returned. That was 8 hours ago. 8 hours of 2 small children sitting on a metal bench in February, waiting for someone who had no intention of coming back. Marcus stood up and walked into the store. He bought 2 hot chocolates from the deli counter and came back out. He sat with them on that freezing bench, and they drank their hot chocolate, while the sun continued to sink toward the horizon. Neither child asked him who he was. Neither child acted afraid. They just sat there, and Marcus sat with them, and the world got darker around them. When the police cruiser finally pulled up, 2 officers stepped out. Marcus watched as their eyes landed on him, a black man, sitting beside 2 small white children in the gathering dark. He watched as their hands drifted toward their belts before a single question was asked. "Sir, what's your relationship to these children?" Marcus explained. He explained it calmly, without defensiveness, without any of the fear that might have been justified. He explained again, and then a 3rd time. Because the first 2 times didn't seem to register as believable. He was just a man who had walked by, just a stranger who had stopped, just someone who bought hot chocolate and sat with 2 kids while their aunt didn't come back. But the officers looked at him, the way people looked at a math equation that didn't add up, and Marcus understood. In that moment, something he had understood many times before in his life, that some people would always see the color of his skin. Before they heard the content of his words, they would always calculate risk differently. When he was involved, they would always start with suspicion instead of trust, before the officers took the children away. The little girl, Sophia, turned around in the back seat of the cruiser and looked at Marcus through the window. One of the officers asked her a question. "Did the man do anything to you? Anything to hurt you? Anything wrong?" Sophia shook her head and in a voice so small, so impossibly small, it barely carried through the glass, she said, "He bought us hot chocolate." It was the first sentence she had spoken all day. 2 months passed. Marcus went back to his routine. Work, home, porch, silence, night shift at the mill. The dark hours when most people slept. The quiet hours when he could think about nothing at all, if he tried hard enough. But something had shifted inside him. He couldn't stop thinking about that boy's arm, around his sister. He couldn't stop hearing that girl's small voice, through the glass. Couldn't stop seeing those gray eyes that carried too much weight. For a 7-year-old, he told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself those kids were in the system now, and the system would take care of them. The system was designed for this. It was what it was supposed to do. Then he heard something, through a church friend who worked at the county office, that the 2 children, Thomas and Sophia, had already been moved through 3 foster homes in 8 weeks. No family wanted both of them. Thomas refused to be separated from his sister. Every time a placement tried to take just one, Thomas would shut down completely, wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak, wouldn't move from the front door. He would just stand there, staring at nothing, holding on to his sister, like she was the last solid thing, in a world that kept trying to tear him apart. So they kept getting sent back, and the file kept getting thicker, and the kids kept getting shuffled, like cards that nobody wanted to deal. Marcus heard this, and something crystallized inside him, a clarity that frightened him a little, because he recognized in it the seed of a decision that would change everything. He filed the adoption paperwork on a Tuesday morning, before his shift. The reactions came fast and hard. The social worker assigned to his case, a white woman in her 50s named Diane, looked at him over the top of her glasses, with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral, and failing spectacularly. "Mr. Jefferson, you understand that these children are, well, they're Caucasian. You're aware of that?" "I'm aware," Marcus said. "And you're a single man living alone, in the South Side neighborhood." She glanced at the file in front of her, like the address confirmed something suspicious. "You work nights, I'm aware of where I live too," Marcus said. The judge ordered 3 home inspections. Not 1. 3. Like there was something about Marcus, something about this situation, that required extra scrutiny. Marcus's own neighbors, black folks who had known him for years, pulled him aside after church one Sunday. "Sam, you're bringing trouble into your house. A black man raising 2 white kids in this town. You're painting a target on your back. Don't do this to yourself." Marcus heard them. He understood them. He filed the next round of paperwork anyway. It took 6 months. 6 months of interviews and background checks and home visits and questions. Questions that circled the same suspicion, dressed up in different words. Questions about his finances, his support system, his mental state. Questions designed to find something, to disqualify him, to find some reason to say no. But Marcus had nothing to hide. He was steady. He showed up. He answered every question directly. On a bright morning in August of 2004, a judge signed the papers. Marcus Jefferson became the legal father of Thomas and Sophia Jefferson. That first night, Marcus set up the spare bedroom, with 2 small beds he had bought from a second-hand store. He attached a star-shaped nightlight to the wall. Above the headboard, he built a bookshelf himself, over the weekend, using scrap wood from the mill, sanding it smooth, painting it white. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't perfect, but it was made with his hands, and it was meant for them. Sophia fell asleep within minutes, the deep, instant sleep of a child who had finally felt safe enough to close her eyes in the dark, without fear. But Thomas lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his body rigid under the covers. Marcus could see it. even from the doorway. The tension in his small shoulders, the way his hands gripped the edge of the blanket, like he was afraid it would be taken away. Marcus checked on them before turning in. He stood in the doorway, watching, not wanting to intrude, but needing to see them in the quiet of the house, needing to confirm that this was real, that they were here, that he hadn't imagined this choice into being. Thomas's gray eyes opened and found his in the darkness. "Are you going to leave, like the others?" Thomas's voice was flat, not sad, not pleading, just flat, like he was asking about the weather, like the answer didn't matter, because he already knew what it would be. Marcus didn't answer with words. He pulled the chair from the corner of the room, set it beside Thomas's bed, and sat down. He stayed there the entire night, his head tilted back, asleep but present, a constant, a witness to the fear. When Thomas woke up the next morning, Marcus was still sitting in that chair, his body stiff from the position, his head still tilted back, but present, and something in Thomas's gray eyes shifted, just slightly, like a door that had been locked for a very long time was cracking open by a fraction of an inch. Part 2. The building. 21 years of struggle and discovery. The years that followed were not easy. They were never going to be easy. A black single father, raising 2 white children in rural Georgia. That was a sentence. That made people uncomfortable. No matter which side of the color line they stood on, it was an equation. That didn't balance in their minds. It violated some unspoken rule about how the world was supposed to work. The first day of school set the tone. Marcus walked Thomas and Sophia through the front doors of Jefferson Elementary, holding each of their hands. The teacher at the welcome desk smiled at the children, then looked up at Marcus. The smile evaporated. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden recoil. It was just a small thing, a micro-expression. The moment when her brain registered something unexpected, and her face rearranged itself into something more careful. "And you are?" she asked. "Their father," Marcus said. The word hung in the air for a moment. She processed it. She was trying to reconcile the information with what she was seeing. Black man, 2 white children, no obvious biological connection. The story didn't fit the narrative she had in her head. "Oh, I see," she said, in the tone of someone who didn't see it all. Over the years, Thomas and Sophia learned that they stood out, not just because they looked different from each other, but because of the looks that followed them. Through hallways and classrooms, Thomas got blamed for things he didn't do. Teachers assumed he was responsible. When classroom supplies went missing, when there was trouble during recess, their expectations for him were lower than they were for white children. It was invisible in some ways, but not to Thomas. He felt it. He learned it. Sophia got pushed around on the playground. White children called her adoption, and the way they said it was like an insult. Parents would call their children away. When Sophia approached, would say things about that family in tones designed to be out of earshot, but loud enough to be heard anyway. Marcus would pick her up from school sometimes and see the exhaustion on her face. Not physical exhaustion, but emotional exhaustion. The fatigue that comes from being unwanted, from being marked as different, from existing in a space where you're not supposed to belong. At a PTA meeting one year, a parent stood up and openly questioned whether Marcus should be allowed to raise white children. She framed it as concern for their well-being, as if what she really meant was concern about their future, their social standing, their ability to move through the world without being tainted by association with a black household. The room went quiet. Some people looked down at their laps. Some people looked angry. 1 or 2 looked like they wanted to say something, but didn't. Marcus sat there, and listened. He didn't fight, he didn't explain, he didn't try to convince anyone of his worth or his right to be there. He just sat, with steady, unmovable presence. The presence that said, "I am not going anywhere. I am not leaving. I am not backing down. Because you're uncomfortable every single night." When he came home from his shift, he checked on Thomas before turning off any lights. That was his ritual. That was enough. Thomas had given up on the question of whether Marcus would leave. He had gotten his answer in those first nights, but the world was still trying to tell him that his family wasn't real, that it didn't count, that it was temporary at best and fraudulent at worst. Thomas absorbed these messages and turned them into something else. He turned them into purpose. He decided that if the world said his family shouldn't exist, then he would prove the world wrong. He buried himself in books. He taught himself to read at a level beyond his age. He absorbed knowledge like it was water, and he was a plant that had been left in the sun too long. By the time Thomas was in high school, he was top of his class, brilliant in ways that made even skeptical teachers have to acknowledge his intelligence. His essays were published in the school newspaper. He was invited to debate competitions. He stood on stages and spoke with a clarity and eloquence that made people stop and listen. It was during those high school years that Dr. Elaine Garrison came into their lives. Elaine Garrison was the kind of teacher who made students uncomfortable. She taught American history at Jefferson High School, and she had a way of asking questions that didn't have easy answers. She didn't accept excuses. She didn't accept the sanitized version of history that was in the textbook. She pushed. She challenged. She made students sit with their discomfort until they either grew or shut down entirely. In her junior year of high school, when Elaine first showed up at the school, Thomas had learned to protect himself through silence. He was brilliant, but he was also guarded. He didn't volunteer in class. He sat in the back row, with his arms crossed, when Elaine started teaching a unit on civil rights. Thomas became even more withdrawn. He would look out the window during the lectures. He refused to engage with the material, even though clearly he understood it. One day, Elaine stopped in the middle of her lecture. "Thomas, stand up." He didn't move. "You think silence is safer than speaking? Tell me why that is." Thomas stared at her, like she had slapped him. The whole class went quiet. He could have gotten up. He could have walked out. But something in her question caught him, held him, forced him to sit with it. When Elaine called Marcus a few weeks later, it was the first time they had actually talked, not a passing conversation, not a quick exchange at a school event, an actual conversation. "Mr. Jefferson, this is Dr. Elaine Garrison. I teach Thomas at Jefferson High. I wanted to talk to you about him." Marcus felt his chest tighten. This was the phone call that meant trouble. The phone call that meant your child had done something wrong, had stepped out of line, had made a mistake. "Is he okay?" Marcus asked. "He's more than okay. He's extraordinary. But he's protecting himself. I'm trying to understand why, and I thought maybe you could help me with that." So Marcus told her. Not everything. Marcus believed in privacy, in boundaries, in not turning his family's pain into content for people to consume. But enough to help this woman understand that Thomas's silence wasn't a choice. It was a survival mechanism. It was something he had learned because his world had taught him that it was safer to be quiet than to speak. Over the weeks and months that followed, Elaine Garrison began to see Thomas differently, not as a struggling student with potential, but as someone who had learned not to expect the world to be kind to him, Someone who had built walls to protect himself from a world that had already broken him once, before he even turned 7 years old. And that made Elaine curious, not just about Thomas, but about who had built those walls so carefully, who had taught him to be safe, who had showed him that he was worth protecting. Elaine began to investigate. Marcus Jefferson. She wasn't obvious about it. She didn't come right out and ask, but she would mention things casually. In conversations with Thomas, she would listen to the way he talked about his father. She would pay attention to the small details. That revealed something about the man who had chosen to love 2 children who weren't his biological children. The more Elaine learned, the more fascinated she became. Here was a man who had broken through one of the strongest walls in American society, a black man who had fought against the system, fought against his community, fought against the entire culture of a small southern town to raise 2 white children, not because he wanted recognition, not because he wanted to be a hero, but because he saw 2 children who needed someone, and he couldn't not show up. When Thomas was accepted to law school, Elaine called Marcus directly. I wanted to meet with you, to celebrate with you, but also I wanted to meet you properly. I think you've been teaching me something, and I want to understand what that is. They met at a diner on a Tuesday afternoon. Marcus came straight from his shift at the mill. He was wearing his work clothes. His hands still had the faint traces of sawdust. That never quite came out, no matter how much he washed them. He looked tired, in the way that comes from 30 years, of working with his body, from the accumulated exhaustion, of maintaining machinery, of showing up, of persisting. Elaine arrived in a tailored blazer and expensive heels. She had a leather portfolio with her. Her watch looked like it cost more than Marcus made in a month. Everything about her screamed privilege. Not cruel privilege, just the kind that comes from a life where certain doors had always been open, where certain options had always been available, where she had never had to choose between her integrity and her survival. They sat in a corner booth. A waitress brought them coffee. "Thank you for meeting me," Elaine said. Marcus nodded. He didn't say much. He had learned that sometimes it was better to listen than to speak, to let other people fill the silence. "Thomas is extraordinary," Elaine continued. "I've taught a lot of students, smart ones, brilliant ones. But there's something different about him. It's like he carries something that most people don't have, a kind of clarity about what matters, a moral clarity." Marcus stirred his coffee slowly. He learned that Marcus said, "From watching, from seeing that some things you do, regardless of the cost." Elaine leaned forward slightly. "Why did you adopt him? Really? I want to understand." Marcus was quiet for a long time, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full of thought. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. "Because he needed someone, and I could be that someone." "That's not a complete answer," Elaine said. "No, but it's the answer I got." Elaine heard something in his voice then. Not defensiveness, not evasion, just the exhaustion of a man who had spent years explaining himself to people who didn't really want to understand, who had gotten tired of justifying his choices to a world that questioned his right to love children who didn't look like him. "You've lived a very different life than I have," Elaine said. It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement. "Yes," Marcus agreed. "I grew up with options. I had parents who could afford things. Education, travel, opportunities. When something went wrong, I had a safety net. I could take risks because I knew someone would catch me if I fell." Marcus nodded slowly. He knew where this was going, and he understood where she was coming from. "You're trying to do good with that," he said. It wasn't a judgment, it was an observation. But I'm operating from a place of privilege, aren't I? I'm helping you because it's the right thing. But I can afford to help. I can afford to care about everyone because I don't have to choose between my integrity and my survival. That's the difference between us. Marcus looked at her directly then. Not unkindly, just clearly. Now you understand what that's like, he said. Living without a net. Having to choose between things. You can't afford to lose. Before Elaine left that afternoon, she asked Marcus one more question. If you could do it all over again, knowing everything you know now, knowing how hard it would be, knowing how the world would treat you for it, would you still choose to adopt them? Marcus didn't hesitate. Every single day, he said. Elaine left that diner, fundamentally changed, not just in how she thought about Thomas, but in how she thought about herself. She had spent her whole life operating from a place of safety. She had used that safety to do good things, to help people, to be a teacher who challenged and inspired. But she had never risked anything that really mattered. She had never put her career on the line for something she believed in. She had never felt what it was like to choose integrity when integrity cost everything. Over the following years, Elaine began to investigate something that had caught her attention. A story about wage theft at Blackwell Lumber Mill. A story about a company that was getting rich by cutting corners on safety. A story that would eventually lead her back to Marcus Jefferson and back to a truth she would have to risk everything to tell. For 17 years, Marcus had worked at Blackwell Lumber Mill. He had started there before he even adopted Thomas and Sophia. He had become part of the machinery, of the mill, the person people called when something broke, when something needed to be fixed, when the delicate balance of wood being processed at speed needed someone to make sure nothing fell apart. He knew every inch of that mill. He knew every machine. He knew where the problems were, where the shortcuts were being taken, where corners were being cut. And he knew something else, too. He knew that the safety budget was being diverted. It started small. A requisition for equipment. That never arrived. A repair order. That was marked complete. But the repair was never actually done. Marcus noticed these things. The way you notice. Small cracks in a wall. At first they seem like nothing, but over time, you realize those small cracks are spreading. They're getting bigger, and pretty soon, the whole structure is compromised. Marcus investigated quietly. He didn't make a big show of it. He just kept records. He documented everything. He found the pattern. Someone was systematically stealing money. Money that was supposed to go to safety equipment and diverting it elsewhere. Equipment that would prevent injuries. Equipment that might save someone's life. He traced it back to Vernon Blackwell, the owner of the mill, and Carl Hutchins, the general manager, a scheme that had been running for years, money that should have gone to modern machinery, to safety protocols, to protecting the workers who came in every day and risked their bodies to make the company rich. One day Marcus went to his supervisor and told him what he had found. His supervisor's face went pale. "You need to forget about this," the supervisor said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a threat, delivered quietly, but clearly understood. "I can't do that," Marcus said. "You can and you should. You have a family, Marcus. You have kids. Don't throw your life away for this." But Marcus had already made a choice. He had spent his whole life teaching his children that integrity mattered, that you did the right thing, even when it cost you, that you didn't stay quiet, just because speaking up would be painful. How could he teach them that? If he didn't live it himself, he went through the proper channels. He submitted a report to corporate compliance. He documented everything. He was careful and thorough and professional, and nothing happened. The report was filed away. No investigation was opened. No action was taken. The money continued to be diverted. The safety equipment continued to not be installed. The risk continued to grow. So Marcus did something harder. He wrote a detailed report. He documented every instance of fraud. He outlined the safety implications. He submitted it to the safety board and the corporate office and anyone he could think of who might actually do something about it. Vernon Blackwell found out. There was a meeting in Blackwell's office, just Marcus and Blackwell, and the weight of what Marcus had done. Blackwell was cold and quiet and dangerous in a way that made it clear. He had never had to raise his voice to hurt someone. "Do you understand what you've done?" Blackwell asked. "I reported a crime," Marcus said. "You've made an enemy of someone who can destroy you, your job, your home, everything you've built with those kids, everything. You think about that." Marcus left that meeting, knowing that he had crossed a line, that he had painted a target on his back, that his choice to do the right thing had put everything at risk, but he had done it anyway. He had chosen his integrity over his safety, and now he had to live with the consequences. Elaine Garrison was investigating wage theft at Blackwell Lumber Mill. She had spent 3 months on the story, making phone calls, meeting with former employees, digging through financial records and corporate documents. It was the kind of investigation that took time and patience, and the willingness to follow threads that might lead nowhere, but somewhere, in the deep structure of Blackwell's finances. She found something, a name, Marcus Jefferson, a maintenance worker who had submitted a report about safety fraud, a report that had gone nowhere, a report that had been buried. Elaine felt something shift inside her when she read that name. She reached out to Marcus, this time, not to meet for coffee, but to meet officially, to interview him about what he had discovered, to get his side of the story. Marcus was hesitant. "I've already done what I can do," he said. "I reported it. That's where it ends for me." "It doesn't have to," Elaine said. "If you go on record, if you tell me what you found, I can publish it. I can make this public. I can make it impossible for them to ignore." Marcus was quiet for a long time. "And what does that cost you?" he asked. Elaine didn't answer immediately, because the truth was, she didn't know. She was a journalist. She had credibility. She had a platform. But Blackwell was powerful. Blackwell had lawyers. Blackwell had connections. If she published this story, if she went after him publicly, there would be consequences. She knew that. She was choosing to do it anyway. Everything she finally said, "It could cost me everything." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. "Then I have to think about it," he said, "because I can't let you risk something that big for me." "You're not asking me to risk it," Elaine said. "I'm choosing to. That's what you taught me, remember? You choose integrity even when it costs." Over the next few weeks, Marcus and Elaine worked together. Thomas helped too. He was in law school by then, learning about legal precedent and due process, and how the system was supposed to work, in theory, and how it actually worked, in practice. The three of them built a case, not a legal case, but a narrative case, a story of how a man had done the right thing, and how a system had tried to destroy him for it. Marcus told Elaine things he had never told anyone, about the pressure, about the threats, about the way Blackwell had made it clear that Marcus's family was vulnerable, that there were ways to hurt him. That didn't involve confronting him directly, about the fear that kept him awake at night, not fear for himself, but fear for Thomas and Sophia, fear that his choice would somehow damage their lives. Elaine listened to all of it, and her determination hardened. This was a story that needed to be told. This was a man who needed to have his integrity acknowledged. This was a system that needed to be exposed. She didn't know then that her investigation was about to collide with something much bigger than wage fraud. She didn't know that her obsession with understanding Marcus Jefferson was about to lead her into a courtroom, about to lead her to risk everything she had built. She just knew that she had to tell this story. Years passed. Thomas graduated from law school. Sophia became an investigative journalist, following in Elaine's footsteps, working for a smaller outlet, but with the same commitment to truth that her father had modeled for her. Marcus continued working at the mill, continued showing up, continued being the person he had always been. He knew that Blackwell hadn't forgotten. He knew that the threat that had been issued in that office had never really gone away. It was just waiting for the right moment, waiting for the opportunity to strike back. That opportunity came on a February night, just like the night that had changed everything 21 years before. Part 3. The collision arrest, injustice, and investigation. A senior worker named Nathan Price was found dead at the warehouse after hours. Blunt force trauma. A robbery that appeared to have gone wrong. A death that would spark an investigation that would change everything. The police moved quickly, too quickly. They focused on Marcus, too soon. It was like they already knew who they wanted to blame. A badge swipe showed that Marcus had entered the warehouse that night. It proved nothing, except that he had gone to work. But it was something. It was a thread to pull. And then Officer Dale Hutchins came forward. He said he had seen Marcus leaving the warehouse, that Marcus had looked guilty, disheveled and guilty and desperate. Dale Hutchins was Carl Hutchins' nephew. The connections ran deep. The machinery was already in motion. Marcus was arrested, and bail was set. Impossibly high, higher than he could possibly pay, higher than someone in his position could ever hope to raise. Marcus sat in a holding cell and understood what had happened. He understood that he had been set up, that Blackwell had decided that the best way to deal with a whistleblower was to erase him, to make him disappear into the criminal system, to make him a cautionary tale. And the cruelest part was that Marcus had known this was possible. He had known that this was a risk. He had waited, and he had reported the fraud anyway. He had chosen his integrity over his safety. And now, 21 years after adopting 2 children, on a cold February night, his life was imploding because he had chosen to do the right thing. Thomas and Sophia came to the holding facility to see their father. They stood on either side of a glass partition, and Marcus looked at his children, the ones he had chosen, the ones he had raised, the ones who had grown into remarkable people, partly because of what he had taught them, and he said the only thing he could say, "I didn't do this, but we keep going." And in that moment, something shifted in both of them. Thomas had become a lawyer. Sophia had become an investigator. They had spent their whole lives watching their father choose integrity over safety. Now it was their turn to do the same. The case against Marcus Jefferson was built on nothing. A badge swipe that proved he had been at work. An officer's testimony that was convenient and vague. A murder weapon that hadn't been found. A motive that didn't make sense if you actually looked at it. Marcus was a maintenance worker with no criminal record, no history of violence, no connection to the victim, except that they worked at the same place. He was a man who had spent the last 3 weeks preparing his taxes and helping his daughter, Sophia, research a story and going to visit his son, Thomas's first trial as a defense attorney. But Marcus was also black, and Vernon Blackwell was white. And in the calculation that the system sometimes makes, that was enough. To tip the scales, the prosecutor, a man named Richard Mercer, seemed almost disinterested in the details. He presented the evidence in a flat, matter-of-fact way, as if he wasn't actually interested in the truth, just in the conviction, as if what mattered was the outcome, not the facts. Marcus sat in a holding cell, dressed in a prison uniform, and watched his life collapse. From behind glass, the bail hearing was a formality. The judge set bail at $250,000, an amount that was specifically calculated to be impossible. Marcus had no savings. He had never accumulated wealth. Everything he had earned had gone to raising 2 children, to keeping a roof over their heads, to making sure they had what they needed. He had wealth of a different kind. He had the respect of his children. He had their love. He had the knowledge that he had done his best with the time and resources he had. But the system didn't value that kind of wealth. Thomas was there for the bail hearing. He sat in the gallery, wearing a suit he had borrowed, looking older than his years, looking like he was carrying more weight than his shoulders could hold. After it was over, Marcus was taken back to his cell. He sat on the metal bunk and thought about the conversation he had had with Sophia, the one where he had told her to tell the truth, no matter what. He had told her that protecting truth was more important than protecting him. Now he had to trust that both of his children would remember that. The moment Elaine heard that Marcus had been arrested, she knew, without needing to see the evidence. She knew, without needing to understand the charges. She knew, because she had spent years understanding how these systems worked, how powerful people protected themselves, how convenient scapegoats were created. Marcus hadn't killed anyone, she was certain of it, but he was expendable. In the calculation that Vernon Blackwell had made, Marcus had reported fraud. Marcus had threatened Blackwell's operation, and now Marcus was going to prison for a crime he didn't commit, unless someone stopped it. Elaine understood that someone was going to have to be her. She started with the evidence, or rather, with the lack of evidence. She requested the security footage from the warehouse. It had been corrupted, she was told. The footage from the time of the death was just gone, conveniently erased, conveniently absent. She talked to workers at the mill. Most of them were afraid. Most of them wouldn't say anything, but she persisted. She made phone calls. She showed up in person. She made it clear that she knew something had happened, that she knew something was wrong, and that she was going to find out what it was. And then she found Patricia Morgan. Patricia had worked at Blackwell Lumber Mill for 35 years. She had been there longer than anyone. She knew the rhythms of the place. She knew where everything was. She knew the people who worked there, including Vernon Blackwell and Carl Hutchins. Patricia also knew what had happened. The night Nathan Price died, Elaine found her at home, a small house on the edge of town, where Patricia had lived alone since her husband had passed away 5 years before. Elaine showed up unannounced, which was risky, which was intrusive, but which was also necessary. Patricia opened the door and looked at this white woman she didn't know, standing on her porch, and she knew immediately why she was there. "You're here about Marcus Jefferson," Patricia said. "Yes." Patricia stood there for a long moment. She was a woman in her 60s, worn down by decades of physical work, worn down by keeping secrets, worn down by knowing things. that had to stay buried. She looked at Elaine like she was looking at someone, offering her a choice she had been avoiding for months. "You should go," Patricia said. "No," Elaine said. "You should talk to me. Marcus is going to prison for a crime he didn't commit." "You know who really did this?" Patricia's hands started shaking. "I can't. I have a pension. I have a life. If I say anything, if I go against Blackwell, everything I have gets taken away." Elaine understood that. She understood the calculation. She understood what Patricia was weighing. But she also understood that choices matter, that moments matter, that what Patricia decided to do in this moment would either allow an innocent man to disappear or would allow the truth to survive. "He's a good man," Elaine said quietly. "He has 2 children who love him. He did the right thing when it cost him everything, and now he's in prison, and the only person who can save him is someone brave enough to choose truth over safety." Patricia looked at this woman, this stranger, and something in her finally broke. "Come inside," she said. Thomas sat in the law library at his firm, surrounded by case files and legal precedent, and tried to concentrate on the research he was supposed to be doing. He couldn't. All he could think about was his father. All he could see was that moment in the holding cell when Marcus had looked at him and said, "I didn't do this." But we keep going, as if it was just that simple, as if you could just decide to keep going, and everything would work out. Thomas had spent his whole life learning how the system worked. He knew about due process. He knew about evidence. He knew about the burden of proof. And he knew that the case against his father was weak. He knew that the system was supposed to protect innocent people. He also knew that it didn't always. He knew that sometimes the system failed, and innocent people went to prison. And nobody cared, because they didn't matter enough to care about. His father mattered. His father was worth caring about. Thomas put in a call to Elaine Garrison. He hadn't talked to her in years, but he knew she was still investigating things, still chasing truth, still willing to risk things. That mattered. "I heard about your father," Elaine said, when he called. "I need your help," Thomas said. "I think he's being framed." "I know he is," Elaine said. "I'm already looking into it." Relief flooded through Thomas. He wasn't alone in this. There was someone else who understood, someone else who had already started fighting back. Sophia was doing her own research. She was tracking Vernon Blackwell's history. She was interviewing people. She was building a case, not in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. She was using the skills she had learned from her father and the tenacity she had inherited from the woman who had raised her. She was becoming an instrument of truth. Marcus sat in his cell and knew that his children were fighting for him. He knew they were risking their careers and their time and their emotional energy to save him, and it broke his heart a little bit, knowing that they had to do this, knowing that his choice to be a whistleblower had created a situation where his children had to become warriors. But he also knew that he had taught them well. He had taught them that integrity mattered. He had taught them that you didn't stay quiet just because speaking up would cost you. He had taught them that some things were worth fighting for. Now they were applying those lessons to save his life. The motion was filed by Thomas's legal team. A motion to allow an additional witness. A witness who had information that could change everything. Patricia Morgan had decided to speak. It had taken everything in her to make that decision. She had spent months wrestling with it. Elaine had been patient, but persistent. Elaine had shown her articles about other whistleblowers. Elaine had shown her the arrest warrant against Marcus. Elaine had helped Patricia understand that her silence was a choice, and that choice was to let an innocent man be convicted. Finally, Patricia had agreed. She had hired a lawyer. She had made a deal that would protect her as much as possible. She was going to testify that she had been at the warehouse the night Nathan Price died, that she had seen Vernon Blackwell emerging from the back office area, looking disheveled, looking shaken, looking like someone who had just done something terrible, that she had heard Blackwell say something to Carl Hutchins, something about making sure nobody could connect them to what had happened, that she had stayed silent for months because she was afraid, because Blackwell controlled her pension, because Blackwell had ways of making people regret speaking up, because in a company town, power flows from one source, and that source was Blackwell. But Elaine had shown her something. Elaine had shown her that staying silent was a choice too, and Patricia had decided that she couldn't live with that choice anymore. When the motion was filed, Judge Michael Crawford was reluctant. He understood the implications. He understood that allowing this testimony would likely result in the collapse of the case against Marcus. He understood that it would be an embarrassment to the prosecution. He understood that it might bring scrutiny down on the entire investigation, but he also understood that an appellate court would not look kindly on a judge who blocked exculpatory testimony in a murder trial. The calculation shifted. His legacy mattered more than his reluctance. "The motion is granted," Judge Crawford said. "The witness will be heard in the gallery." Elaine sat, with her hands folded. She had taken a risk. She had invested her professional reputation. She had spent months on a story that might not pay off, might not lead anywhere, might just be a story about a man who had blown the whistle and paid the price for it. But now, looking at this motion being granted, looking at the machinery of the system beginning to shift, she understood something. She wasn't fighting for a story anymore. She was fighting for Marcus Jefferson. She was fighting for the principle that truth mattered. She was fighting because a man she had come to respect, a man who had taught her something fundamental about how to live with integrity, was about to be erased, and she couldn't let that happen. The week before the trial, Elaine visited Marcus in the holding cell. She had arranged a contact visit. She sat across from him, and they looked at each other through the accumulated weight of the investigation they had shared, the risk they had both taken, the truth they had both chosen to pursue. "I found Patricia Morgan," Elaine said. "She's going to testify. She's going to tell the jury what she saw." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment. Relief passed over his face, and underneath the relief was something else, something like gratitude, mixed with sadness. Gratitude that someone had believed in him. Sadness that it had taken this much, had required this much sacrifice for the truth to matter. "You risked your career for me," Marcus said. "I risked it for truth," Elaine said. "And yes, for you, because you taught me what that means. You taught me that some things matter more than safety, more than comfort, more than protecting yourself." Marcus looked at her directly. Did you learn that lesson, or are you still learning it? Elaine smiled. A little. Still learning, she said. But I'm learning it. Because of you. When Elaine left, that holding cell, she understood something fundamental about the man. She had been investigating for years. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't a martyr. He was just a person who had decided that certain things mattered more than other things, who had decided that integrity was a practice, not an aspiration, who had decided to show up and do the right thing and accept the consequences. And in doing that, he had changed everyone around him. Part 4. The Justice Courtroom and Resolution. The trial lasted 4 days. The prosecution presented their case first: badge swipe, officer testimony, circumstantial evidence. It was a house of cards. Everyone in the courtroom could see that. The evidence didn't connect. The timeline didn't make sense. The motive was non-existent. But the prosecutor seemed unconcerned. He moved through it, like someone who didn't actually believe in the case, but was obligated to present it anyway. Then Patricia Morgan took the stand. She was sworn in. She raised her hand and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. She sat down in the witness chair, and the courtroom went quiet. This was the moment. This was when the truth was going to confront the lies. Patricia was not a dramatic witness. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply told the truth, in plain, clear language, the way a woman who had spent 35 years keeping careful records tells you what she saw when she saw it. She described Vernon Blackwell emerging from the office area. She described his appearance, the disheveled clothes, the shaking hands, the way he looked like someone who had just committed a violence. She recounted his exact words. "You were never here tonight," she explained, without self-pity and without excuses, why she had stayed silent. The pension, the pressure, the unspoken rules of a company town where one family held all the cards. The prosecutor cross-examined her hard. He asked her why she had waited so long to come forward. He asked her whether she might be fabricating the story out of resentment. He tried to poke holes in her testimony and Patricia with the steadiness of someone who had already paid the price for her truth, simply repeated what she had said. She had seen what she had seen. She hadn't come forward before because she was afraid. She was here now because she couldn't live with her silence anymore. When Patricia stepped down from the stand, something in the courtroom had shifted. The air felt different. The jury was looking at Marcus differently. The judge was looking at the evidence differently. The case against Marcus Jefferson was collapsing. Then Thomas stood for closing argument. He didn't shout. He didn't perform. He spoke the way his father had taught him, to speak plainly, directly, as if truth didn't need decoration to be convincing. My father, Marcus Jefferson, spent 21 years raising 2 children that the world said were not his to raise. He never asked why he should. He never asked what he'd get in return. And when he discovered that equipment at his workplace was failing because someone was stealing money that should have gone to safety repairs, he didn't stay quiet. He reported it. He reported it. Because that is who he is, a man who does the right thing, even when the right thing has a cost. Thomas moved through the evidence methodically. The badge swipe. That proved nothing, except that my client went to work that day. The officer's testimony. That didn't hold up. Under scrutiny, the lack of physical evidence, the lack of motive, the presence instead of another man. who had motive and opportunity and the power to make everyone around him stay silent. You have heard the prosecution's case, Thomas said. You have heard a badge swipe. That proves nothing, except that my client went to work that day. You have heard a witness whose testimony cannot survive. Basic geography. And now you have heard from a woman who saw, with her own eyes, another man leaving the scene of the crime. A man with motive, with opportunity, and with the power to make everyone around him stay silent. Thomas moved toward the jury box. Justice is not something you wait for. It is something you build. Today, you are the builders. He sat down beside his father. He didn't look at Marcus. He knew that if he did, he would break. Instead, he just placed his hand on his father's shoulder and held it there. Marcus looked at his son, the child he had held, in a chair all night, because that child was afraid of abandonment, and realized that his son had become a man who could stand in front of a jury and speak truth, a man who had learned, through the example of his father's life, that integrity was something you did, not something you talked about. The jury deliberated for 47 minutes. 47 minutes to determine whether Marcus Jefferson would be freed, or whether he would spend the rest of his life in prison for a crime he didn't commit. 47 minutes for 12 people to weigh the evidence and the testimony and the absence of facts that would connect Marcus to a murder. It didn't take long. When they came back into the courtroom, the foreman was an older white woman who had sat through every day of the trial with an unreadable face. She stood and unfolded a piece of paper. The courtroom held its breath. On the charge of first-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty. Marcus didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his eyes closed, his hands flat on the table. He was a man who had been holding his breath for weeks. Now he was letting it out. Thomas placed his hand on his father's shoulder, the same gesture from the first day of the trial. And this time, neither of them let go. Sophia came from the gallery and wrapped her arms around both of them, and for a long moment, the three of them held each other in the middle of a courtroom that had tried to tear them apart. Marcus opened his eyes and looked at his children. Both of them were crying. Both of them were strong, in ways that still surprised him, even after all these years. He spoke the first words that came to him. "You two grew up on me." Sophia laughed through her tears, and the sound filled the courtroom the way Linda's laugh used to fill a room, completely without apology, completely real. Outside the courtroom, in the hallway, Elaine was waiting. When Marcus emerged, she stepped forward. They didn't hug. They didn't touch. They just looked at each other. And in that look was everything. Years of investigation, risk taken, truth pursued, a man's life saved by someone's willingness to believe in him. "Thank you," Marcus said. "You don't have to thank me," Elaine said. "You taught me how to do this. You showed me what it looks like to choose integrity, even when it costs everything. I was just following your example." In the weeks that followed, the story broke, wide open. Sophia's investigation was published. The story detailed the financial fraud at Blackwell Lumber, the scheme between Vernon Blackwell and Carl Hutchins, and the cover-up that had nearly sent an innocent man, to prison for life. Federal investigators opened a case. Vernon Blackwell was indicted on charges of fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. Officer Dale Hutchins was arrested for perjury and conspiracy. The machine that had tried to crush Marcus Jefferson was suddenly exposed, dissected, and dismantled in the court of public opinion. Justice, when it finally came through the combined efforts of three people who had chosen to risk everything to pursue truth. A maintenance worker who had reported fraud, knowing it would cost him, a teacher who had become an investigator, who had become a woman willing to risk her career, a man's children who had grown up and fought back against a system that had tried to destroy their father. Marcus went home to his small house on the south side of Macon. The house was older now. The porch was weathered. The paint was faded, but the family photo still hung in the hallway, the same one that had been there for 21 years. The three of them, smiling, real, unbreakable. Sophia took the crayon card. Our family, that young Sophia had drawn all those years ago, and had it sealed in a clear protective case. She placed it on the bookshelf that Marcus had built for her out of scrap lumber on a Christmas morning when money was tight and love was the only currency they had. The card sat there in its case, the crayon lines still bright, enough to read. After all these years, a relic from a time when a little girl drew. The only truth she knew. 3 people, 1 house, and a word that no courtroom, no system, and no amount of injustice had ever managed to take away from them. Family. Marcus sat on his porch that evening and watched the sun go down the way he had done 1,000 times before. Sophia sat on the steps beside him. Thomas leaned against the railing. Nobody spoke for a while. They didn't need to. Some things don't require words. They just require presence. When Marcus finally broke the silence, he said something that neither of his children expected. People always ask me why I adopted you two. I never had a good answer, but I think I do now. He looked at them both. I adopted you because I needed you more than you ever needed me. Sophia smiled and shook her head. Dad, that's the most ridiculous and truest thing you've ever said. 21 years earlier, a man had chosen to love 2 children that the world said weren't his. He asked for nothing. He expected nothing. He simply showed up every single day and built something that everyone told him couldn't last. A family that didn't match in a town that didn't approve. A family held together by nothing more than the stubborn, quiet conviction that love doesn't need permission and justice doesn't wait for an invitation. And in the end, the thing he built was the only thing strong enough to save him. Not the law, not the system, not the town. That watched him struggle for 2 decades and never once offered to help. His children, the ones nobody wanted, the ones he chose, they saved him the same way. He had saved them, not with grand gestures, but with simple, ferocious refusal to let go. Maybe that's the thing worth remembering about this story. Not the courtroom, not the verdict, not even the injustice. The thing worth remembering is that somewhere out there, right now, someone is making a choice to love a person that the world says isn't theirs to love. And that choice, as quiet and unremarkable as it might seem today, might be the one thing that saves them both 21 years from now. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about the people who showed up for you, or the people you've shown up for, drop a comment. And tell us who's your Marcus Jefferson. Tell us about someone in your life who chose integrity, even when it cost everything. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel. Stories like this one deserve to be heard, and you being here is what makes that possible.